Hi, I'm Charlton Copeland, and I'm a professor here at the University of Miami Law School. In the spring, I'll be teaching an elective called the Regulatory State. And so I don't know that many of you know what the regulatory state is, and so I'm going to take a few minutes to explain what the class is about and how I will evaluate your performance in the class. The regulatory state, let me first say, is my favorite class. I've taught it once before, and it was the most exhilarating teaching experience I've had because of the students who took it, and many of them didn't think they were going to take it, but decided to take it after talking with me or talking with someone else about what we'd experienced in the class. If you have any interest in speaking with me after you listen to this video, I welcome any conversations or questions you might have about the course. So what is the regulatory state? Well, you might think that your lives are governed by the Constitution of the United States or by statutes that Congress enacts, but I submit to you that your lives are run primarily by regulatory agencies and the rules that they enact. Congress is an institution, as you know, that enacts legislation. Quite often, that legislation is enacted to solve or resolve problems that come up in our daily lives. And we run campaigns to elect people to Congress who have particular solutions and visions about solving those problems. When they are in Congress, their job is to enact legislation. Often, the legislation that is enacted is what we call aspirational. And by aspirational, I mean that the Clean Water Act's aspiration is to protect and preserve or improve water quality. The ambition of the Clean Air Act is to protect and preserve or improve the quality of our air. Other regulatory statutes have an ambition, for example, to make cars safer, to reduce the risks of deaths in accidents, for example. That's what we call the regulatory state. In the legislative process, Congress often does not implement or offer a method of implementing those aspirational goals. Those aspirational goals are implemented generally by regulatory agencies, by agencies that engage in rigorous scientific study, rigorous economic study, rigorous study of statutes, and rigorous study of the political environments about how best to offer policies to implement and to obtain the goals and objectives that Congress enacts in legislation. And so if the question is, how do we make automobiles safer? How do we reduce the risk that people will die in car accidents? Well, there are a number of ways that we might do that. We might do that by enacting regulations that prohibit people from texting while driving, right? We might do that by enacting regulations that might make it illegal for a person to drive over a certain speed. But we might also do that by enacting regulations that might affect the car's ability to avoid accidents. Specifically, we might impose upon car manufacturers the obligation to install anti-locking brake systems so that cars will be able to stop more effectively, thereby reducing accidents. In order to impose an anti-locking brake system, you have to know something about the way in which cars are manufactured. You have to know something about the additional cost imposed on automobile manufacturers and buyers of automobiles to get the additional safety. These are often questions that Congress is not well equipped to handle. And so Congress will often delegate to administrative agencies the objective of implementing statutes on the basis of, again, rigorous scientific study or rigorous examination of the economics and economic feasibility of a particular policy response. Again, in large part to reach some objective that Congress has set before us. In the 1960s, Congress enacted statutes that delegated authority to the Department of Transportation and to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to reduce the risk of death in car accidents. Now, Congress delegated this broad authority to the Department of Transportation, but again, did not come up with the specific policy proposals about how the agencies would do that. We call those delegations of authority. And so Congress empowered the Department of Transportation to try to resolve and come up with policy responses to reduce the risks of death. We have airbags in our cars because the Department of Transportation studied what caused the risks of death in automobile accidents. Now again, the agency might have simply tried to reduce the number of accidents, but the agency decided that there were other risks. That is to say that there's one risk with respect to having accidents, there's another risk with respect to the effects that accidents have on our bodies. And so the agencies decided to require automobile manufacturers to install airbags so that our bodies would not fly across our cars and hit hard surfaces within our cars, thereby causing additional injury and increasing the risk of death. Likewise, Congress enacted a piece of legislation that delegated authority to the Department of Agriculture to promulgate rules and regulations that would govern the kinds of lunches that school kids would have during the school day. In light of the fact that school students get at least 1/3 and quite possibly over 1/2 of their overall daily calories while in school, the administration thought that if we were going to attack the problem of childhood obesity, that problem would have to be attacked during the school day and would have to articulate rules and regulations with respect to the kinds of meals that students eat at school. And so right now, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is actually promulgating the rules that govern the kinds of meals that students ought to have. And that means how much sodium should be in meals that students eat, how much sugar should be in meals that students eat, how many calories should be in the meals that students eat. That kind of regulatory response is taking place not in Congress, it's taking place in institutions that we call administrative agencies. Similarly, and I know that you guys will know this, in New York, the Bloomberg administration attempted to again reduce incidences of childhood obesity by regulating the size of containers in which people could buy sugary sodas. Now, this policy was the butt of many jokes and met its demise at the hands of state court judges in New York. But the promulgation of those regulations took place in local regulatory agencies. And that's really the subject of the regulatory state. And so the course moves in a couple of directions, and I want to try to explain a few of them. So the first thing we ask is, what is the basis of regulatory policy making? During this semester, you guys have taken classes in tort and contract and property in which the law has attempted to respond after something terrible has happened. There are alternative responses to fending off tragedy. That is to say, we might regulate activity before terrible things happen. And so we might say that you can't bring certain kinds of devices within distances of homes, or that you can't build train tracks that might increase the risk of fire to homes within a certain distance of train tracks. We might do that, right? But you guys have read cases in tort in which you've seen case law develop and responses to tragedies that have taken place, but those responses occur after tragedies take place. Regulation, for the most part, is an attempt to respond before these kinds of bads, as it were, might happen. And so we're going to think about the grounds upon which the state chooses to regulate. That is to say, when does the state decide that markets require regulation? And when does the state decide that forms of law like tort or contract don't effectively respond to the kinds of risks that the government wants to control? And so that's the first question we're going to ask in the course on the regulatory state. So secondly, we're going to ask, what goes into agency decision-making process when they promulgate rules? We're going to look at the economic studies and scientific bases of regulatory decision-making. We're going to look at the legal bases of regulatory decision-making. Primarily, we're going to look at the ways in which agencies interpret their own statutory authority to give them power to either regulate in an area or power to regulate particular entities within an industry. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the political landscape and the role that politics plays in regulatory decision making. I'm going to evaluate your performance in the class in diverse ways. I think that this class allows me an opportunity to give you diverse experiences with respect to the regulatory state. And so the first assignment that you're going to get from me is going to be an evaluation of a proposed piece of legislation. That is to say, you are going to be asked to submit what we call a white paper to a legislative committee in which you either act as a proponent or an opponent of the proposed legislation. You are going to be asked to evaluate that legislation on an economic basis, on a scientific basis, on a legal basis, from a statutory perspective, from constitutional perspectives perhaps, and we're going to ask you to comment on that legislation from a political perspective. Secondly, I'm going to give you an assignment that asks you to participate in the regulatory process. Specifically, you're going to be asked to write a comment as an interested party in a proposed rulemaking. As such, you will be asked again to either serve as an opponent of the proposed rule or an opponent of the proposed rule. And again, you're going to be asked to evaluate the agency's proposed rule on an economic basis, on a scientific basis, on legal bases, and then on a political basis. And then finally, I'm going to give you a final exam. And the final exam in the class that I taught the last time was primarily a statutory interpretation exercise. That may be the case again this semester, but I haven't yet decided. But we know that you'll have two really good opportunities to do some exciting writing work, both in the legislative context and in the regulatory context, and you'll take a traditional law school exam in which you'll have a fact pattern and you'll be asked to respond to the fact pattern using the tools that you've learned in the course. Again, as I said at the beginning of this tape, I've only taught this course once, but it proved to be the most exciting teaching experience of my career. I had 15 students in that class. I got to know each of them really well, and that class just graduated in the spring of 2014, and they are among my closest friends with respect to students that I've taught. Many of them are off to really exciting opportunities. More than a few of them have spent time in DC and are headed back to DC, and I think that they're going to have really, really wonderful careers. And I hope that my class and this experience played some role in that. I hope that if you have, again, any questions at all, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk to you about the course. Thanks so much.